Welcome to week 7 of ALC314. And as you can see, our title this week is Branding and Branding Culture. And we're trying to get ourselves wrapped around the idea of how our culture has actually shifted quite dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years, specifically related to brands. And if you think about it, brands in the context of how they are including us in the constitution of value, the value within our culture. So let's get into this a little bit. Now, as you can see from these things, is that, and I'm using the word ubiquitous, and you can look that up later, but it basically means it's everywhere. And I guess the question is, why has branding become something that we see on everything? I've tried to use the example, and we use Christine Harold's article this week, so I want you to read that one quite closely, is that we begin to brand ourselves as much as or as close to the way that value is determined within our culture. So it's not that we have immediately, spontaneously got the idea that we should brand ourselves. It's that the culture has shifted enough that we feel that this is more important than almost anything else that we can do. So you can see that some of this thinking that Harold is referring to is connected to something that is called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is an idea of the way in which we have to, in the contemporary moment, construct ourselves, make ourselves an entrepreneurial kind of self. And it's related to an analysis of government from about the 1980s onwards, which tried to shrink the importance of government or the importance of those kinds of institutions protecting us, and increase the idea that we were more or less providing the materials for us to become entrepreneurial people. And so whether it's Reagan or Thatcher, or to a degree probably even Howard, but quite different in Australia, we were moved into an era of, yes, branding, but personal branding. And part of that is that it has expanded even further through social media, that we're all engaged in what I described last week when we were talking about the intercommunication industries and trying to describe this new smart advertising, is that we're all engaged in some construction of ourselves. And what is the purpose of that construction? Well, it's to advertise ourselves or promote ourselves in some way that connects to other people. And so what has occurred is simultaneously there's this personal branding, but there is also a lot of activity that is producing this notion of us defining ourselves through the brands that surround us, so that we become brand ambassadors, or if we're taking a larger stance especially in the online world, we become thought leaders, that we somehow take something and make ourselves distinctive in that particular way. So brand as distinction, thought leaders, brand ambassadors, weird sort of phenomena that emerge in the contemporary moment. Now, Harold comes from, the person who wrote the thing called Brand You, comes from probably a rhetorical communication background. And she has come up with saying that we shouldn't dismiss this entirely, that in a sense, us constructing ourselves as brands is a new kind of ethos, that we're trying to identify a convincing version of ourselves to an audience, a convincing version of ourselves that is prudent and exercises good judgment, and somehow that it can be taken and used more widely in our culture. Now, it may or may not be the case that this is the way that we can manage it, but she was trying to say that it isn't all negative, it isn't completely crazy that people would do this, and that in a way it's kind of managing or working ourselves through what has occurred in contemporary capitalism. Now, the brands that I've listed here are powerful contemporary brands, but they're also the kinds of brands that are looking to and talking about personalized sort of power. And whether it's Uber or Airbnb or Nike, which is, if you think of it's different kinds of slogans, but it's basically the idea that you should invest in yourself to produce a better version of yourself, or even Apple's one, which came out about a decade ago, about think different, which is bad grammatically, but is describing this idea that you're going to empower yourselves into the world. And as a person or through a particular company, you're going to feel that empowerment and feel positive about this new sense of where you are positioned within the culture and how that is not that dissimilar from the most powerful brands in the world. Let's go on a little bit from there. So, from another reading for this week, which is the Lurie and Moore reading, which is all about this topological culture that she describes and brand valuation that they describe as critical to understanding what has happened, what has made brands so powerful. The key element with this sort of thing is that branding has occurred, no question, has been around for quite a while, but the difference is that it became something in accounting itself. In corporate culture itself, it began to have a distinctively separate value. And so once that was captured or attempted to be captured and then was legitimized, it also made it clear that the present and the future were possible ways that these intangible assets of brands become much more tangible. So brands are beyond the sort of concrete things that we might think of as a product. They're beyond those sorts of things. And firms and companies have worked towards brand valuation. The key one that is mentioned in the article is Interbrand. And I put a little logo of them because they also are branding themselves. And they're a company that has worked out the logic and the accounting rituals to establish the value of a brand within a culture. And interestingly, again, it's the present and future value of the brand that is critical for understanding it. It isn't really there, but a brand is something that if you sell a company to someone else, it's the brand itself that actually has the greatest amount of power behind it. So instead of just a bottom line in corporations, there's a triple bottom line, according to some thinkers. And one part is social responsibility, that a company is often looking at how they can express their relationship to an audience, to their consumers, but not just in a straightforward way, but in a sense of how they contribute to that culture kind of completely. Now, as well, they're the assets themselves, the bricks and mortar and the products themselves and how much they're worth and all those things. But the third one is that they've integrated this idea of the goodwill of the brand itself. And how do we calculate that? How do we calibrate that into the contemporary notion of the corporation and capitalism itself? So what brands are is the relationship to the consumer. How important they are to the consumer and how important they are is actually, and significant in their lives, actually defines the power of that particular corporation. And so what this last point is that in the contemporary moment, this idea of establishing value and how much we're attached to it is actually monitored to a really high degree by all those different firms like Google Analytics and Web Analytics and what they describe as Harvest 2.0, that they look at the way that we use our words and the positive and negative words that we associate with particular brands and give us this all back. And in that way, they rank all the corporations, at least in brands. And you can see that up here, you can't see it closely, but I hope you can see it later, that you can see some of the top brands are things like Apple and Google. And clearly there's IBM somewhere in there and Facebook and on and on and on. You see some of the most powerful brands, McDonald's down here about 10th or so. And you can see that they're playing in a big sort of sweepstakes that is now organized into accounting rituals. And that accounting ritual is more or less defining its power in the stock market itself. And the stock market itself, if you think about it, is also determined by shareholders' relationships to their understanding of brands. And this is very, very powerful in determining the ethereal quality of corporations in the contemporary moment, and it has massive, massive resources behind it to ensure that any brand is very, very powerful. Now, having said all that, one of the things to think about is how brands have moved across our culture. So it's not that they're just all these corporations, and we've mentioned Uber and a bunch of other ones, but they're also defining states and cities as well. And they're working their way through that we begin to see it not as just the present value, but an attachment that might be the case for your determination of what you might do in the future. And that value is also integrated into these rankings that companies like Interbrand do for corporations. Hope that's clear. It's a difficult idea, but I hope it's clear. Now, this week, I want you to begin thinking about brands, no question. I want you to do the two readings that are critical, the brand you reading and the reading about this topological culture. I want you to realize that the future and the present is connected to brands itself and brands' value. And value is what I want you to think about related to brands very specifically this week. How much are you attached to them, and how much are you drawn to the idea that brands are central to our culture right now? So one of the things I've talked about in various sort of settings is I've talked about that we're very much attached to a portfolio culture, that we produce versions of ourselves for all sorts of environments. So are we a brand? And are we comfortable with that definition? Does it commodify ourselves? And is that okay? So is it an ethos that we can deal with quite directly? How do you regulate yourself? How do you make yourself good? Or maybe, as Harold describes, kind of an ethical sort of person who's also kind of making money as well. And what do you put forward as your portfolio? Is there a danger in brand culture in defining ourselves like other assets, which are intangible, like they're relationship assets? And that's the key thing to think about, that brands are building kinds of relationships that we don't really imagine that they would be as powerful, in accounting terms, but they are, and they're powerful in our culture, that we use them as incredible shorthands for all sorts of things, a kind of new notion of influence and power. I want you to do that, but I also want you to begin to think of this related to your campaign work and what you're going to do in the second gallery assignment. So look at some of the material related to that assignment, but also read the other readings. There's two other readings. They're not difficult readings, but they're going to help you. One's on storyboarding. So how do we construct the notion of a presentation of an ad campaign, but specifically, probably in commercials or some other way, how are you going to do it? And you could do the sophisticated way, or as you see in the assignment itself, quite simple. I don't expect brilliant artists here. I expect you to be able to explain things well when you go forward in these campaigns. And the Parenti reading might even be more important at this stage than the Tuminello reading. And that is developing the idea of how to structure a campaign and how to present that, because that's what you're going to do for the second assignment. You're going to pitch this, you're going to pitch it pretty hard to me. And it could be quite similar to the way that I'm pitching these ideas to you, or you could vary it a little bit and do it in a much more written form. Either way, you're trying to convince me of a certain type of campaign. And within that, I want you to think about the power of the brand and the building of relationships that has now become organized as an economic, accounted and accounting structure within our contemporary corporate capitalism. Unbelievable change. And it's all happened in the last 20 years. Anyway, get to it. Hope to see you on the discussion board discussing these things. And this is probably the most fascinating thing that we've done so far. Integrate the past stuff you've done into this stuff this time. See you on the discussion board. Bye-bye.